Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Saul Talking. Today, being that it's Friday, the work will be due by 2:15. This video will be pretty quick and pretty simplistic. Essentially, what I want to do is do two things. One is talk to you guys about U.S. mobilization efforts and how that represented the US's engagement in a total war, and then also look at some propaganda, which was actually going to be kind of fun. So there's two video questions to make sure you need to answer. So before we get started into what the US was doing in terms of the government to get ready for the war, it's important to keep in mind that World War I is the largest war ever fought in world history up to this point. Of course, that would be eclipsed by World War II, one generation later, 20 years later. But um, it's important to keep in mind that World War I represents a total war, and a total war is one in which those involved, those nations involved, are really making extreme sacrifices, both just obviously in terms of the fighting of the war, but they're making extreme sacrifices in terms of the civilian populations, in terms of the resources for the country that's being devoted to the war effort. So obviously for in world the case World War One and most wars historically, you're talking about obviously young men who are serving, but that's not just it. You're talking about industries that are entirely switched to being devoted to supplying war effort, war supplies. So obviously, if it's a shoe company, let's say, if you're a European shoe company or a U.S. shoe company, now you're devoted. Maybe the government of your country is telling you to make boots for the war or make socks. That means that for civilians, they're going to be demanded to make efforts to raise money for the war or devote their time to conserving resources, perhaps. And also, this means a lot of spending, tons and tons and tons and tons of money. In fact, for the U.S. government, this will be the most expensive venture up to this point in American history. And again, we'll talk about World War II, which surpasses that. But the iconic image you see the right of the Uncle Sam poster "I Want You" is also of World War I, and we'll talk about that piece of propaganda and propaganda that's also being made as part of this total war effort to get everybody involved to make sure that all aspects of society are ready to fight. So the most basic thing that the government needs to do in order to prepare is to create a large enough military force to fight. The last time in class that we talked about the U.S. engaging in a war was the Spanish-American War in 1898. And you might remember the Spanish-American War was really tiny. I mean, you're talking about 4,000 people dying, mainly because of, I believe it's mainly because of diseases. It's not because of the fighting itself. The fighting was very brief. And the war in the Philippines, even by scale, is so much tinier than World War One. For the U.S. to get involved in this war, it needs to establish a draft, and essentially that leads to the creation of what's called the Selective Service Act and the Selective Service System, which we still have in the United States, although we don't have a draft. And the laws have changed about it, but essentially it requires now it's all 18-year-olds, but at the time in 1917 it was requiring all 21 to 31-year-olds to be prepared to serve. They have to, be required to go to their local, typically county, whatchamacallit, agency, their local county board of the draft board, and let them know, like, hey, I'm eligible service, and if you didn't, you're disobeying the law, which we'll talk about people who did disobey. Ultimately, 24 million men of this age group sign up. 3 million end up serving, and keep in mind that a lot of them are immigrants. 1 in 5 are immigrants, which is a disproportionate number. At the time, 1 in 5 Americans weren't immigrants, but 20% of those who served were actually foreign-born, who were immigrants looking to get naturalized in the United States and become citizens. Many of them don't even have high school education. Most of them certainly don't have college education. This is mainly a war, as we'll talk about with other wars, that is fought by the lower classes. And women are obviously not included historically in not just the United States, but all throughout the world in service. There are many women who honorably involve themselves in the Army Corps of Nurses, but they're denied the same treatment that men are given. They're denied rank, they're denied pay, they're denied benefits that men would receive. And that didn't stop many women, and we talked about this with women's suffrage movement, that tens of thousands of women accepted non-combat roles, and in fact, tens of thousands of women in the United States did fundraising and donated their time and energy even if they were denied the right to vote, they still supported the country through their efforts to support the United States in the war. So that's one part of mobilization, which is very obvious, getting the country ready militarily. The other part of it is, how do you pay for this? Spending on wars, and particularly that by this point it's super large amounts of money. You're talking about billions of dollars and what would be today considered trillions of dollars. So the government creates agencies to kind of try to get the financing through, to make sure that there's partnerships to make sure that we can afford this as a country and not go into massive amounts of debt. So the War Industries Board, or the WIB, is created. The WIB is an interesting agency that essentially works with private companies, major industrial companies, to produce war supplies. So that means obviously weapons, but that might also mean uniforms. That might also mean that you need to conserve oil or electricity for the country, to make sure that those companies have more resources to send overseas to Europe. This also leads to a major boom in the economy. The economy, particularly in these industries like meatpacking or in oil and steel, are skyrocketing. This is World War One is economically a successful time for the United States, in terms of the average income from everyone from labor, workers, and also obviously for corporate profits. The United States government also creates the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration. These are programs and agencies designed to, communicate the need for conservation of resources. This is the introduction of daylight savings time, is World War One. The introduction of the concept of like meatless Mondays, lightless nights, victory gardens. These are all efforts by the government, and mainly this is through, as you can see to the right, with propaganda, to get the United States to feel patriotic about doing your part to help the country, even if you can't serve necessarily. That you can still conserve energy for the country, and it's considered part of the larger war effort. Victory gardens, for example, were created in the backyard of many American homes to not go grocery shopping, so that food might be able to go to Europe for the people who are fighting, of course. Including in the financing isn't just working with private companies and making sure people are conserving energy, but it's also about raising money through taxes. Obviously, you might remember that the 16th Amendment, or the income tax, is created only 4 or 5 years before World War One is involved with the United States is involved in World War One. So there is a very high top marginal tax rate. So if you're making lots of money, you're getting taxed on that money. You also have higher taxes in states on luxury goods. So things that aren't needed, like tobacco or liquor, are going to be higher taxed items. This was considered patriotic to pay that extra tax, because you're going to be helping the war effort. And then the United States raised billions of dollars through what were called liberty or war bonds. And bonds are essentially when the government is asking for citizens of the country to give money, and over time the government is going to pay you back with interest. And it's considered part of the patriotic duty. If you could see this piece of propaganda, it says if you can't enlist, you can still support the war effort. There's the Statue of Liberty associating patriotism with donations of money. And the United States government raised billions and billions of dollars through Liberty bonds. Why do I keep doing that, guys? I mean, I apologize. But the United States government's raising money through bonds and also through higher taxes, right? So, like I said, the war effort's about getting men to fight, about getting the nation as a whole, including women and young children, involved as much as they can, and also paying for all of this. The last thing I want to hit on is really critical to modern warfare, which is really the creation of propaganda. It's with World War One, both in America and in European countries, where you start to see governments really taking a large effort into creating a boosting morale. And some can call this nationalism. Some people can call it, patriotism. But really, the government even creates a government agency called the Committee on Public Information. It sounds like something out of, like, I don't know, North Korea if you imagine it, but it really does. It's a government agency that was devoted to making propaganda to support the war effort. And propaganda, as you guys will look at, is information. Generally, these are things done through posters in World War One. We'll talk about in World War II. We'll show videos and everything from Looney Tunes cartoons to movies. But in World War One, it's really posters or pamphlets, small books about war, about why we should be in the war. And obviously, all of this is biased towards getting Americans or citizens to feel that it's their patriotic duty. And we'll look at how government at the time, how the U.S. government at the time tried to appeal to people. But there also is like major popular songs. I'm not going to play them. Maybe I'll play them in class on Monday, but some real bangers, guys. No, I mean, there are seriously super famous pieces of music composed and paid for by the U.S. government to get Americans to support the war effort. And if you want to be creeped out, you can look at the poster to the right, which is a young girl on the lap of Uncle Sam talking about how even young kids are going to help the war effort by saving your money. The government was willing to do just about anything to raise money and pay for the war and make sure Americans were supportive of the war. They were very nervous about, and we'll talk about this more next week, they were very nervous about people like Eugene V. Debs criticizing them. So, if you have any questions about any of those major topics that we touched upon right there, let me know in class. But essentially what I want you to answer is a pretty straightforward question in like a brief paragraph. So how did U.S. mobilization efforts in World War I reflect a nation engaged in total war? So thinking about what a total war is, how do the U.S.'s efforts during this time represent that? Essentially, how does the U.S. At the time reflect that definition of total war? And just give two examples. You could be two agencies that were created or anything of that nature to essentially answer that question. So the second thing that I want you guys to do is look at some pieces of propaganda and identify which you find to be most effective. So, I showed you earlier the I Want You Uncle Sam poster, which is perhaps the most iconic and famous piece of propaganda from this era. But I figured, being that it's Halloween, I'd also show you guys something a little bit creepier. This one reads, they give their lives. Do you lend your savings? Obviously, trying to get, as you can see in the corner, it says war savings stamps issued by the U.S. government, and essentially trying to get Americans to give money to the government to support the war effort, right? It's a really dark and super kind of creepy piece of propaganda, but I think it kind of works for that reason. It makes you kind of feel quite emotionally charged about it. And then another scary one in honor of Halloween, that liberty shall not perish from the earth, buy Liberty bonds. Another attempt by the government here to get Americans to buy Liberty bonds. So what I want you to do is think about 5 things when you look at these pieces of propaganda. Typically, propagandists, people who make these things, are using 5 major techniques to get an appeal and get people to act on whatever they want. So one is demonization, which is, to make the other side look bad, look demonic, and look evil. The other is to appeal to emotions, obviously, trying to make you feel sad or sympathetic or empathetic, to try to get you to act. The other is name calling. You'd often see pieces of propaganda that are referring to a group of people. During this time, you might have the Germans referred to as brutes, maybe, to suggest that they were evil. You might have patriotic appeals, which are, of course, the use of patriotic language or symbols like the American flag or certain colors to invoke you to feel and thus act. And then you have slogans. I mean, the I Want You piece of propaganda is iconic for that reason, and it's a catchy slogan, and it's as American as you can think of in terms of popular culture. It's just everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So what I want you to do at the end here, really simply, is which of the 3 do you think is most effective, and just tell me in 3 or 5 sentences why you think it's most effective based on those techniques. So thinking about the techniques that I had just mentioned, these 5 techniques: demonization, emotional appeals, name calling, patriotic appeals, catchy slogans. Obviously, you can pause at any point in this video to like make sure you're understanding. You know, you don't need to go crazy here to keep it on the screen. But of those five, you know, give me a couple that are being used in answering that question of which you think is most effective. All right, I'm just at 15 minutes. I talked too much. I hope you all have a good weekend. Reach out and email me if you have questions. I'll see y'all on Monday. Be well.